properly, shall we? Let's set up a proper. Finally, the music has stopped. All right, let's do this properly, shall we? Let me set up. Let me set up a scene. Reading scene. Get a nice fireplace background with cookies. Maybe. Fireplace. Uh, videos. How's this one? Maybe. That might do. Maybe. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, it's little. Yeah. Okay. Um. All right. Add. Let's see. We want display capture. Add existing. Okay. And we will set this to. Hold on. Transform. Fit to screen. There we go. This should be good enough. I will also add a image. Add existing gear. Okay. And we will center this to screen. Transform. Center to screen. And we'll make that a little bit smaller. We will full screen this. And we will center center horizontally. There we go. And add image again. Profile. Okay. Browse. Recordings. Logos and drawn art. Oh, wrong one. No, that is. No, it's not the right one. Let's do files. Sorry, everybody. I'm putting a little bit too much effort into this, I think, but it's all for a good fun time, I think. No, not zip files. Get lighter. Stream assets. Here we go. Okay, there we are. And this goes behind that. And filters. Add a image mask. Okay. Browse. And where did I put the thing? Ah, there it is. And Alpha mask. Here we go. Almost done, everybody. And transform center horizontally. There we go. And one more finishing touch. Add audio visualizer. No. Add spectralizer. Waveform visualizer. There we go. Wonderful. So if we do a little something like this. And then transform center horizontally. And round the sound. There we go. Let's turn that down just so that it's in the background. Okay. How does that look, everybody? Yes, thank you. Change title and game category. I guess. Audio. What would we class this as? I mean, it's just chatting, technically. But what would we class? Like, is it audiobook reading? Auditory information transfer. I like it, but it's a little long. Saturday Story Corner. The Hogfather. There we go. How's that? I like it. I like it a lot. All right. Shall I start from the beginning, or shall we go from where I left off? I'll start from the beginning. Get a clear bit of audio. All right. So, here we go. The Hogfather by Terry Pratchett. Everything starts somewhere, although many physicists disagree. But people have always been dimly aware of the problem with the start of things. They wonder aloud how the snowplow driver gets to work, or how the makers of dictionaries look up the spelling of the words. Yet there is the constant desire to find some point in the twisting, knotting, raveling nets of space-time on which a metaphorical finger can be put to indicate that here is the point where it all began. One moment, I just realized I almost forgot something. There we go. Something began when the Guild of Assassins enrolled Mr. Teatime, who saw things differently from other people. And one of the ways that he saw things differently from other people was in seeing other people as things. Later, Lord Downey of the Guild said, "We took pity on him, because he'd lost both parents at an early age. I think that on reflection, we should have wondered a bit more about that." But it was much earlier even than that, when most people forgot that the very old stories are, sooner or later, about blood. Later on, they took the blood out to make the stories more acceptable to children, or at least to the people who had to read them to children, rather than the children themselves, who, on the whole, are quite keen on blood, provided it's being shed by the deserving, and then wondered where the stories went. And earlier still, when something in the darkness of the deepest caves and the gloomiest forests thought, "What are they, these creatures? I will observe them." And much, much earlier than that, when the Discworld was formed, drifting onwards through space atop 4 elephants on the shell of the giant turtle, Great Atuin. Possibly, as it moves, it gets tangled like a blind man in a cobwebbed house in those highly specialized little space-time strands that try to breed in every history they encounter, stretching them and breaking them and tugging them into new shapes. Or possibly not, of course. The philosopher Didactylos has summed up an alternative hypothesis as things just happen, what the hell? The senior wizards of the unseen university stood and looked at the door. There was no doubt that whoever had shut it wanted it to stay shut. Dozens of nails secured it to the doorframe. Planks had been nailed right across. And finally, it had, up until this morning, been hidden by a bookcase that had been put in front of it. "And there's the sign, Ridcully," said the dean. "You have read it, I assume? You know the sign which says, 'Do not under any circumstances open this door.'" "Of course I've read it," said Ridcully. "Why do you think I wanted it opened?" Why?" said the lecturer in recent runes. "To see why they wanted it shut, of course." He gestured to Modo, the university's gardener and odd-job dwarf, who was standing by with a crowbar. "Go to it, lad." The gardener saluted. "Right you are, sir." Against a background of splintering timber, Ridcully went on. "It says on the plans that this was a bathroom. There's nothing frightening about a bathroom, for God's sake. I want a bathroom. I'm fed up with sluicing down with you fellows. It's unhygienic. You can catch stuff. My father told me that. Where you get lots of people bathing together, the Veruca gnome is running around with his little sack." "Is that like the Tooth Fairy?" said the dean sarcastically. "I'm in charge here, and I want a bathroom of my own," said Ridcully firmly. "And that's all there is to it, all right? I want a bathroom in time for Hogswatch night, understand?" And that is the problem with beginnings, of course. Sometimes, when you're dealing with occult realms that have quite a different attitude to time, you get the effect a little way before the cause. From somewhere on the edge of hearing came a gling, gling, gling noise, like little silver bells. At about the same time as the Arch-Chancellor was laying down the law, Susan Stowe-Hellett was sitting up in bed, reading by candlelight. Frost patterns curled across the windows. She enjoyed these early evenings. Once she had put the children to bed, she was more or less left to herself. Miss Gator was pathetically scared of giving her any instructions, even though she paid Susan's wages. Not that the wages were important, of course. What was important was that she was being her own person and holding down a real job. And being a governess was a real job. The only tricky bit had been the embarrassment when her employer found out that she was a duchess, because in Mrs. Gator's book, which was a rather short book with big handwriting, the upper crust wasn't supposed to work. It was supposed to loaf around. It was all Susan could do to stop her curtsying when they met. A flicker made her turn her head. The candle flame was streaming out horizontally, as though howling in wind. She looked up. The curtains billowed away from the window, which flung itself open with a clatter. But there was no wind. At least, no wind in this world. Images formed in her mind. A red ball, the sharp smell of snow, and then they were gone, and instead there were... "Teeth," said Susan aloud. "Teeth again!" She blinked. When she opened her eyes, the window was, as she knew it would be, firmly shut. The curtain hung demurely. The candle flame was innocently upright. Oh no, not again. Not after all this time. Everything had been going so well. "Susan!" She looked around. Her door had been pushed open, and a small figure stood there, barefoot in a nightdress. She sighed. "Yes, Twyla. I'm afraid of the monster in the cellar, Susan. It's gonna eat me up." Susan shut her book firmly and raised a warning finger. "What have I told you about trying to sound ingratiatingly cute, Twyla?" she said. The little girl said, "You said I mustn't. You said that exaggerated lisping is a hanging offense and I only do it to get attention." "Good. Do you know what monster it is this time?" "It's the big hairy one with..." Susan raised the finger. "Ah," she warned. "With 8 arms," Twyla corrected herself. "What, again? Oh, all right." She got out of bed and put on her dressing gown, trying to stay quite calm while the child watched her. So they were coming back. Oh, not the monster in the cellar, that was all in a day's work, but it looked as if she was going to start remembering the future again. She shook her head. However far you ran away, you always caught yourself up. But monsters were easy, at least. She'd learned how to deal with monsters. She picked up the poker from the nursery fender and went down the back stairs, with Twyla following her. The Gators were having a dinner party. Muffled voices came from the direction of the dining room. Then, as she crept past, a door opened, and yellow light spilled out, and a voice said, "Ye gods! There's a girl in a nightshirt out here with a poker!" She saw figures silhouetted in the light, and made out the worried face of Mrs. Gator. "Susan? What are you doing?" Susan looked at the poker, and then back at the woman. "Twyla said she's afraid of a monster in the cellar, Mrs. Gator." "And you're going to attack it with a poker, eh?" said one of the guests. There was a strong atmosphere of brandy and cigars. "Yes," said Susan, simply. "Susan's our governess," said Mrs. Gator. I told you about her." There was a change in the expression on the faces peering out from the dining room. It became a sort of amused respect. "She beats up monsters with a poker," said someone. "Actually, that's a very clever idea," said someone else. Little gal gets it into her head there's a monster in the cellar. You go in with the poker and make a few bashing noises while the child listens, and then everything's all right. Good thinking, that girl. Very sensible, very modern. Is that what you're doing, Susan? Said Mrs. Gator anxiously. Yes, Mrs. Gator, said Susan obediently. This I've got to watch, by lo. It's not every day you see monsters beaten up by a girl, said the man behind her. There was a swish of silk and a cloud of cigar smoke as the diners poured out into the hall. Susan sighed again and went down the cellar stairs while Twyla sat demurely at the top, hugging her knees. A door opened and shut. There was a short period of silence, and then a terrifying scream. One woman fainted, and a man dropped his cigar. You don't have to worry. Everything will be all right, said Twyla calmly. She always wins. Everything will be all right. There were thuds and clangs, and then a whirring noise, and finally a sort of bubbling. Susan pushed open the door. The poker was bent at right angles. There was nervous applause. Very well done, said the guest. Very psychological. Clever idea, that. Bending the poker. And I expect you're not afraid any more, eh, little girl? No, said Twyla. Very psychological. Susan says don't get afraid, get angry, said Twyla. Thank you, Susan, said Mrs. Gator, now a trembling bouquet of nerves. And now, Sir Geoffrey, if you would all like to come back into the parlour, I'm in the drawing room. The party went back up the hall. The last thing Susan heard before the door shut was, dashed convincing, the way she bent the poker like that. She waited. Have they all gone, Twyla? Yes, Susan. Good. Susan went back into the cellar and emerged towing something large and hairy with 8 legs. She managed to haul it up the steps and down the other passage to the backyard, where she kicked it out. It would evaporate before dawn. That's what we do to monsters, she said. Twyla watched carefully. And now it's bed for you, my girl, said Susan, picking her up. Can I have the poker in my room for the night? All right. It only kills monsters, doesn't it? The child said sleepily, as Susan carried her upstairs. That's right, Susan said. All kinds. She put the girl to bed next to her brother and leaned the poker against the toy cupboard. The poker was made of some cheap metal with a brass knob on the end. She would, Susan reflected, give quite a lot to be able to use it on the children's previous governess. Good night. Good night. She went back to her own small bedroom and got back into bed, watching the curtains suspiciously. It would be nice to think she'd imagined it. It would also be stupid to think that, too. But she'd been nearly normal for 2 years now, making her own way in the real world, never remembering the future at all. Perhaps she had just dreamed things. But even dreams could be real. She tried to ignore the long thread of wax that suggested that the candle had, just for a few seconds, streamed in the wind. As Susan sought sleep, Lord Downey sat in his study catching up on the paperwork. Lord Downey was an assassin, or rather an assassin. The capital letter was important. It separated those curs who went around murdering people for money from the gentlemen who were occasionally consulted by other gentlemen who wished to have removed for a consideration any inconvenient razor blades from the candy floss of life. The members of the Guild of Assassins considered themselves cultured men who enjoyed good music and food and literature, and they knew the value of human life, to a penny in many cases. Lord Downey's study was oak-panelled and well-carpeted. The furniture was very old and quite worn, but the wear was the wear that comes only when very good furniture is carefully used over several centuries. It was matured furniture. A log fire burned in the grate. In front of it, a couple of dogs were sleeping in the tangled way of large, hairy dogs everywhere. Apart from the occasional doggy snore or the crackle of a shifting log, there were no other sounds but the scratching of Lord Downey's pen and the ticking of the long case clock by the door, small private noises which only served to define the silence. At least this was the case until someone cleared their throat. The sound suggested very clearly that the purpose of the exercise was not to erase the presence of a troublesome bit of biscuit, but merely to indicate, in the politest possible way, the presence of the throat. Downey stopped writing, but did not raise his head. Then, after what appeared to be some consideration, he said in a businesslike voice, "The doors are locked, the windows are barred, the dogs do not appear to have woken up, the squeaky floorboards haven't, other little arrangements which I will not specify seem to have been bypassed. That severely limits the possibilities. I really doubt that you are a ghost, and gods generally do not announce themselves so politely. You could, of course, be deaf, but I don't believe he bothers with such niceties, and besides, I am feeling quite well." Something hovered in the air in front of his desk. "My teeth are in fine condition, so you are unlikely to be the tooth fairy. I've always found that a stiff brandy before bedtime quite does away with the need for the Sandman. And, since I can carry a tune quite well, I suspect I'm not likely to attract the attention of Old Man Trouble." The figure drifted a little nearer. "I suppose a gnome could get through a mouse hole, but I have traps down," Downey went on. "Bogeymen can walk through walls, but would be very loath to reveal themselves. Really, you have me at a loss." And then he looked up. A grey robe hung in the air. It appeared to be occupied, in that it had a shape, although the occupant was not visible. The prickly feeling crept over Downey that the occupant wasn't invisible, merely not in any physical sense there at all. "Good evening," he said. The robe said, "Good evening, Lord Downey." His brain registered the words. His ears swore they hadn't heard them. "But you did not become the head of the Assassin's Guild by taking fright easily. Besides, the thing wasn't frightening, it was, thought Downey, astonishingly dull. If monotonous drabness could take on a shape, this would be the shape it would choose. "You appear to be a spectre," he said. "Our nature is not a matter for discussion," arrived in his head. "We offer you a commission." "You wish someone inhumed," said Downey. "Brought to an end." Downey considered this. It was not as unusual as it appeared. There were precedents. Anyone could buy the services of the guild. Several zombies had, in the past, employed the guild to settle scores with their murderers. In fact, the guild, he liked to think, practiced the ultimate democracy. You didn't need intelligence, social position, beauty, or charm to hire it. You just needed money, which, unlike the other stuff, was available to everyone. Except for the poor, of course, but there was no helping some people. Brought to an end. That was an odd way of putting it. We can, he began. The payment will reflect the difficulty of the task. Our scale of fees, the payment will be $3 million. Downey sat back. That was 4 times higher than any fee yet earned by any member of the guild, and that had been a special family rate, including overnight guests. No questions asked, I assume, he said, buying time. No questions answered. But does the suggested fee represent the difficulty involved? The client is heavily guarded. Not guarded at all, but almost certainly impossible to delete with conventional weapons. Downey nodded. This was not necessarily a big problem, he said to himself. The guild had amassed quite a few unconventional weapons over the years. Delete, an unusual way of putting it. We like to know for whom we are working, he said. We are sure you do. I mean that we need to know your name, or names. In strict client confidentiality, of course, we have to write something down in our files. You may think of us as the auditors. Really? What is it you audit? Everything. I think we need to know something about you. We are the people with $3 million. Downey took the point, although he didn't like it. $3 million could buy a lot of no questions. Really, he said. In the circumstances, since you are a new client, I think we would like payment in advance. As you wish. The gold is now in your vaults. You mean that it will shortly be in our vaults, said Downey. No, it has always been in your vaults. We know this because we have just put it there. Downey watched the empty hood for a moment. Then, without shifting his gaze, he reached out and picked up the speaking tube. Mr. Winvo, he said, after whistling into it. Ah, good. Tell me, how much do we have in our vaults at the moment? Oh, approximately. To the nearest million, say. He held the tube away from his ear for a moment, and then spoke into it again. Well, be a good chap and check anyway, will you? He hung up the tube and placed his hands flat on the desk in front of him. Can I offer you a drink while we wait? He said. Yes, we believe so. Downey stood up with some relief and walked over to his large drinks cabinet. His hand hovered over the guild's ancient and valuable Tantalus, with its labeled decanters of myrrh, nig, trop, and yikshu. And what would you like to drink? He said, wondering where the auditor kept its mouth. His hand hovered for just a moment over the smallest decanter, marked Nosyop. We do not drink. But you did just say I could offer you a drink. Indeed, we judge you fully capable of performing that action. Ah. Downey's hand hesitated over the whiskey decanter, and then he thought better of it. At that point, the speaking tube whistled. Yes, Mr. Winvo? Really? Indeed. I myself have frequently found loose change under sofa cushions. It's amazing how it No, I wasn't being... Yes, I did have some reason to. No, blame attaches to you in any way. No, I could hardly see how it... Yes, go and have a rest. What a good idea. Thank you. He hung up the tube again. The cowl hadn't moved. We will need to know where, when, and of course, who, he said after a moment. The cowl nodded. The location is not on any map. We would like the task to be completed within the week. This is essential. As for the who, a drawing appeared on Downey's desk, and in his head arrived the words, "Let us call him the Fat Man." "Is this a joke?" said Downey. "We do not joke." "No, you don't, do you?" Downey thought. He drummed his fingers. "There are many who would say this person does not exist," he said. "He must exist. How else would you so readily recognize his picture? And many are in correspondence with him." "Well, yes, of course. In a sense, he exists." "In a sense, everything exists. It is cessation of existence that concerns us here." "Finding him would be a little difficult." "You will find persons on any street who can tell you his approximate address." "Yes, of course," said Downey, wondering why anyone would call them persons. It was an odd usage. "But as you say, I doubt that they could give a map reference. And even then, how could the Fat Man be inhumed? A glass of poisoned sherry, perhaps?" The cowl had no face to crack a smile. "You misunderstand the nature of employment," it said in Downey's head. He bridled at this. Assassins were never employed. They were engaged or retained or commissioned, but never employed. Only servants were employed. "What is it that I misunderstand exactly?" he said. "We pay. You find the ways and means." The cowl began to fade. "How can I contact you?" said Downey. "We will contact you. We know where you are. We know where everyone is." The figure vanished. At the same moment, the door was flung open to reveal the distraught figure of Mr. Winvo, the guild treasurer. "Excuse me, my lord, but I really had to come up." He flung some discs on the desk. "Look at them." Downey carefully picked up a golden circle. It looked like a small coin, but... "No denomination," said Winvo. "No heads, no tails, no milling. It's just a blank disc. They're all just blank disc." Downey opened his mouth to say valueless. He realized that he was half hoping that this was the case. If they, whoever they were, had paid in worthless metal, then there wasn't even the glimmering of a contract. But he could see this wasn't the case. Assassins learned to recognize money early in their careers. "Blank discs," he said, "of pure gold." Winvo nodded mutely.
That, said Downey, will do nicely. It must be magical, said Winvo, and we never accept magical money. Downey bounced the coin on the desk a couple of times. It made a satisfyingly rich, bunking noise. It wasn't magical. Magical money would look real, because its whole purpose was to deceive. But this didn't need to ape something as human and adulterated as mere currency. This is gold, it told his fingers. Take it or leave it. Downey sat and thought while Winvo stood and worried. We'll take it, he said. But thank you, Mr. Winvo. That is my decision, said Downey. He stared into space for a while and then smiled. Is Mr. Teatime still in the building? Winvo stood back. I thought the council had agreed to dismiss him, he said stiffly, after that business with... Mr. Teatime does not see the world in quite the same way as other people, said Downey, picking up the picture from his desk and looking at it thoughtfully. Well, indeed, that's certainly true. Please send him up. The guild attracted all sorts of people, Downey reflected. He found himself wondering how it had come to attract Winvo, for one thing. It was hard to imagine him stabbing anyone in the heart in case he got blood on the victim's wallet. Whereas Mr. Teatime... The problem was that the guild took young boys and gave them a splendid education, and incidentally taught them how to kill, cleanly and dispassionately, for money and for the good of society, or at least that part of society that had money, and what other kinds of society was there? But very occasionally, you found you'd got someone like Mr. Teatime, to whom the money was merely a distraction. Mr. Teatime had a truly brilliant mind, but it was brilliant like a fractured mirror, all marvelous facets and rainbows, but ultimately also something that was broken. Mr. Teatime enjoyed himself too much, and other people also. Downey had privately decided that sometime soon Mr. Teatime was going to meet with an accident. Like many people with no actual morals, Lord Downey did have standards, and Teatime repelled him. Assassination was careful game, usually played against people who knew the rules themselves, or at least could afford the services of those who did. There was considerable satisfaction in a clean kill. What there wasn't supposed to be was a pleasure in a messy one. That sort of thing led to talk. On the other hand, Teatime's corkscrew of a mind was exactly the tool to deal with something like this, and if he didn't, well, that was hardly Lord Downey's fault, now was it? He turned his attention to the paperwork for a while. It was amazing how the stuff mounted up. But you had to deal with it. It wasn't as though they were murderers, after all. There was a knock at the door. He pushed the paperwork aside and sat back. "Come in, Mr. Teatime," he said. It never hurt to put the other fellow slightly in awe view. In fact, the door was opened by one of the guild servants, carefully balancing a tea tray. "Ah, Carter," said Lord Downey, recovering magnificently. "Just put it on the table over there, will you?" "Yes, sir," said Carter. He turned and nodded. "Sorry, sir, I will go and fetch another cup directly, sir." "What?" "For your visitor, sir." "What visitor?" "Oh, when Mr. Teatime—" He stopped. He turned. There was a young man sitting on the hearth rug, playing with the dogs. "Mr. Teatime."
"It's pronounced Teatame,
sir, said Tea Time, with just a hint of reproach. Everyone gets it wrong, sir. How did you do that? Pretty well, sir. I got mildly scorched on the last few feet, of course. There were some lumps of soot on the hearthrug. Downey realized he'd heard them fall, but that hadn't been particularly extraordinary. No one could get down the chimney. There was a heavy grid firmly in place near the top of the flute. But there's a blocked-in fireplace behind the old library, said Tea Time, apparently reading his thoughts. The flues connect under the bars. It was really a stroll, sir.
Really?
Oh, yes, sir. Downey nodded. The tendency of old buildings to be honeycombed with sealed chimney flues was a fact you learned early in your career. And then, he told himself, you forgot. It always paid to put the other fellow in awe of you, too. He had forgotten they taught that, too. The dogs seem to like you, he said. I get on well with animals, sir. Tea Time's face was young and open and friendly, or at least it smiled all the time. But the effect was spoiled for most people by the fact that it had only one eye. Some unexplained accident had taken the other one, and the missing orb had been replaced by a ball of glass. The result was disconcerting, but what bothered Lord Downey was far more was the man's other eye, the one that might loosely be called normal. He'd never seen such a small and sharp pupil. Tea Time looked at the world through a pinhole. He found he'd retreated behind his desk again. There was that about Tea Time. You always felt happier if you had something between you and him. You like animals, do you? He said. I have a report here that says you nailed Sir George's dog to the ceiling. Couldn't have it barking while I was working, sir. Some people would have drugged it. Oh. Tea Time looked despondent for a moment, but then he brightened. But I definitely fulfilled the contract, sir. There can be no doubt about that, sir. I checked Sir George's breathing with a mirror as instructed. It's in my report. Yes, indeed. Apparently, the man's head had been several feet from his body at that point. It was a terrible thought that Tea Time might see nothing incongruous about this. And the servants? He said. Couldn't have them bursting in, sir. Downey nodded, half hypnotized by the glassy stare and the pinhole eyeball. No, you couldn't have them bursting in, and an assassin might well face serious professional opposition, possibly even by people trained by the same teachers. But an old man and a maidservant who'd merely had the misfortune to be in the house at the time. There was no actual rule, Downey had to admit. It was just that over the years the guild had developed a certain ethos, and members tended to be very neat about their work, even shutting doors behind them and generally tidying up as they went. Hurting the harmless was worse than a transgression against the moral fabric of society. It was a breach of good manners. It was worse even than that. It was bad taste. But there was no actual rule. That was all right, wasn't it, sir? Said Tea Time, with apparent anxiety. It, lacked elegance, said Downey. Thank you, sir. I'm always happy to be corrected. I shall remember that next time. Downey took a deep breath. It's about that I wish to talk, he said. He held up the picture of what had the thing called him, the fat man. As a matter of interest, he said, how would you go about inhuming this gentleman? Anyone else, he was sure, would have burst out laughing. They would have said things like, "Is this a joke, sir?" Tea Time merely leaned forward with a curious, intent expression. Difficult, sir. Certainly, Downey agreed. I would need some time to prepare a plan, sir, Tea Time went on. Of course, and there was a knock at the door, and Carter came in with another cup and saucer. He nodded respectfully to Lord Downey and crept out again. Right, sir. I'm sorry, said Downey, momentarily distracted. I have now thought of a plan, sir, said Tea Time, patiently. You have? Yes, sir. As quickly as that? Yes, sir. Ye gods. Well, sir, you know we are encouraged to consider hypothetical problems. Oh, yes, a very valuable exercise. Downey stopped and then looked shocked. You mean you have actually devoted time to considering how to inhume the Hogfather, he said weakly. You've actually sat down and thought out how to do it. You've actually devoted your spare time to the problem. Oh, yes, sir. And the soul-cake duck, and the Sandman, and death. Downey blinked again. You've actually sat down and considered how to... Yes, sir. I've amassed quite an interesting file. In my own time, of course. I want to be quite certain about this, Mr. Tea Time. You have applied yourself to a study of ways of killing death. Only as a hobby, sir. Well, yes, hobbies, yes. I mean, I used to collect butterflies myself, said Downey, recalling those first moments of awakening pleasure at the use of poison and the pin. But, actually, sir, the basic methodology is exactly the same as it would be for a human. Opportunity, geography, technique. You just have to work with the known facts about the individual concerned. Of course, with this one, such a lot is known. And you've worked it all out, have you? Said Downey, almost fascinated. Oh, a long time ago, sir. When, may I ask? I think it was when I was lying in bed one Hogswatch night, sir. My God, thought Downey, and to think that I used to just listen for sleigh bells. My word, he said loud. I may have to check some details, sir. I'd appreciate access to some of the books in the dark library. But, yes, I think I can see the basic shape. And yet, this person, some people might say that he is technically immortal. Everyone has their weak spots, sir. Even death. Oh, yes. Absolutely. Very much so. Really? Downey drummed his fingers on the desk again. The boy couldn't possibly have a real plan, he told himself. He certainly had a skewed mind, skewed, it was positively helix. But the fat man wasn't just another target in some mansion somewhere. It was reasonable to assume that people had tried to trap him before. He felt happy about this. Tea time would fail, and possibly even fail fatally if his plan was stupid enough. And maybe the guild would lose the gold, but maybe not. Very well, he said. I don't need to know what your plan is. That's just as well, sir. What do you mean? Because I don't propose to tell you, sir. You'd be obliged to disapprove of it. I'm amazed that you are so confident that it can work, Tea Time. I just think logically about the problem, sir, said the boy. He sounded reproachful. I suppose I just see things differently from other people, said Teatame. It was a quiet day for Susan. Although on the way to the park, Gawain trod on a crack in the pavement, on purpose. One of the many terrors conjured up by the previous governess's happy way with children had been the bears that waited around the street to eat you if you stood on the cracks. Susan had taken to carrying the poker under her respectable coat. One wallop generally did the trick. They were amazed that anyone else saw them. Gawain, she said, eyeing a nervous bear who had suddenly spotted her and was now trying to edge away nonchalantly. Yes, you meant to tread on that crack, so that I'd have to thump some poor creature whose only fault is wanting to tear you limb from limb. I was just skipping. Quite. Real children don't go hoppity-skip unless they are on drugs. He grinned at her. If I catch you being twee again, I will knot your arms behind your head, said Susan levelly. He nodded and went to push Twyla off the swings. Susan relaxed, satisfied. It was her personal discovery. Ridiculous threats didn't worry them at all, but they were obeyed, especially the ones in graphic detail. The previous governess had used various monsters and bogeymen as a form of discipline. There was always something waiting to eat or carry off bad boys and girls for crimes like stuttering or defiantly and aggravatingly persisting in writing with their left hand. There was always a scissor man waiting for a little girl who sucked her thumb, always a bogeyman in the cellar. Of such bricks is the innocence of childhood constructed. Susan's attempts at getting them to disbelieve in the things only caused the problems to get worse. Twyla had started to wet the bed. This may have been a crude form of defense against the terrible, clawed creature that she was certain lived under it. Susan had found out about this one the first night, when the child had woken up crying because of a bogeyman in the closet. She'd sighed and gone to have a look. She'd been so angry that she'd pulled it out, hit it over the head with the nursery poker, dislocated its shoulder as a means of emphasis, and kicked it out the back door. The children refused to disbelieve in the monsters because, frankly, they knew damn well the things were there. But she'd found out that they could, very firmly, also believe in the poker. Now she sat down on a bench and read a book. She made a point of taking the children every day somewhere where they could meet others of the same age. If they got the hang of the playground, she thought, adult life would hold no fears. Besides, it was nice to hear the voices of little children at play, provided you took care to be far enough away not to hear what they were actually saying. There were lessons later on. These were going a lot better now she'd got rid of the reading books about bouncy balls and dogs called Spot. She'd got Gawain onto the military campaigns of General Tacticus, which were suitably bloodthirsty, but more importantly, considered too difficult for a child. As a result, his vocabulary was doubling every week, and he could already use words like disemboweled in everyday conversation. After all, what was the point of teaching children to be children? They were naturally good at it. And she was, to her mild horror, naturally good with them. She wondered suspiciously if this was a family trait, and if, to judge by the way her hair was so readily knotted itself into a prim bun, she was destined for jobs like this for the rest of her life. It was her parents' fault. They hadn't meant to turn out like this. At least she hoped charitably that they hadn't. They'd wanted to protect her, to keep her away from the worlds outside this one, from what people thought of as the occult, from, well, from her grandfather, to put it bluntly. This had, she felt, left her a little twisted up. Of course, to be fair, that was a parent's job. The world was so full of sharp bends that if they didn't put a few twists in you, you wouldn't stand a chance of fitting in. And they'd been conscious and kind and given her a good home and even an education. It had been a good education, too. But it had only been later on that she realized that it had been an education in, well, education. It meant that if ever anyone needed to calculate the volume of a cone, then they could confidently call on Susan Stowe-Hellett. Anyone at a loss to recall the campaigns of General Tacticus or the square root of 27.4 would not find her wanting. If you needed someone who could talk about household items and things to buy in the shops in 5 languages, then Susan was at the head of the queue. Education had been easy. Learning things had been harder. Getting an education was a bit like communicable sexual disease. It made you unsuitable for a lot of jobs, and then you had the urge to pass it on. She'd become a governess. It was the one of the few jobs a known lady could do. And she'd taken to it well. She'd sworn that if she did indeed ever find herself dancing on rooftops with chimney sweeps, she'd beat herself to death with her own umbrella. My apologies, everyone. I couldn't help myself from laughing just then. And then Jack chopped down the beanstalk, adding murder and ecological... Oh, no, I skipped a paragraph. After tea, she read them a story. They liked her stories. The one in the book was pretty awful, but the Susan version was well received. She translated as she read. And then Jack chopped down the beanstalk, adding murder and ecological vandalism to the theft, enticement, and trespass charges already mentioned. But he got away with it, and lived happily ever after without so much as a guilty twinge about what he had done, which proves that you can be excused just about anything if you're a hero, because no one asks inconvenient questions. And now she closed the book with a snap. It's time for bed. The previous governess had taught them a prayer which included the hope that some god or other would take their soul if they died while they were asleep, and if Susan was any judge, had the underlying message that this would be a good thing. One day, Susan averred that she'd hunt that woman down. "Susan," said Twyla from somewhere under the blankets. "Yes?" "You know last week we wrote letters to the Hogfather?" "Yes." "Only, in the park, Rachel says he doesn't exist, and it's your father, really. And everyone else, she said she was right." There was a rustle from the other bed. Twyla's brother had turned over and was listening surreptitiously. Oh dear, thought Susan. She'd hoped she could avoid this. It was going to be like that business with the soul-cake duck all over again. "Does it matter if you get the presents anyway?" she said, making a direct appeal to greed. "Yes." Oh dear, oh dear. Susan sat down on the bed, wondering how the hell to get through this. She patted the one visible hand. "Look at it this way, then," she said, and took a deep, mental breath. Wherever people are obtuse and absurd, and wherever they have, by even the most generous standards, the attention span of a small chicken in a hurricane, and the investigative ability of a one-legged cockroach, and wherever people are inanely credulous, pathetically attached to the certainties of the nursery, and, in general, have as much grasp of the realities of the physical universe as an oyster has of mountaineering. Yes, Twyla, there is a Hogfather. There was silence from under the bedclothes, but she sensed that the tone of voice had worked. The words had meant nothing. That, as her grandfather might have said, was humanity all over. "Good night." "Good night," said Susan. It wasn't even a bar. It was just a room where people drank while they waited for other people with whom they had business. The business usually involved the transfer of ownership of something from one person to another, but then, what business doesn't? 5 businessmen sat around a table, lit by a candle stuck in a saucer. There was an open bottle between them. They were taking some care to keep it away from the candle flame. "It's gone 6, said one, a huge man with dreadlocks and a beard you could keep goats in. The clocks struck ages ago. "He ain't coming. Let's go." "Sit down, will you? Assassins are always late because of style, right?" "This one's mental. Eccentric. What's the difference? A bag of cash." The 3 that hadn't spoken yet looked at one another. "What's this? You never said he was an assassin," said Chickenwire. "He never said that guy was an assassin, did he, Banjo?" There was a sound like distant thunder. It was Banjo Lillywhite clearing his throat. "That's right," said a voice from the upper slopes. "You's never said that." The others waited until the rumble died away. Even Banjo's voice hulked. The first speaker waved his hands vaguely, trying to get across the point that someone was a hamper of food. Several folding chairs, a tablecloth, an assortment of cooking gear, and an entire colony of ants short of a picnic. Mental. "And he's got a funny eye." "It's just glass, all right," said the one known as Cat's Eye, signaling a waiter for 4 beers and a glass of milk. "And he's paying $10,000 each. I don't care what kind of eye he's got." "I heard it was made of the same stuff they make them fortune-telling crystals out of." "You can't tell me that's right." "And he looks at you with it," was the first speaker. He was known as Peachy, although no one ever found out why. Cat's Eye sighed. Certainly, there was something odd about Mr. Teatame. There were no doubts about that. But there was something weird about all assassins. And the man paid well. Lots of assassins used informers and locksmiths. It was against the rules, technically, but standards were going down everywhere, weren't they? Usually they paid you late and sparsely, as if they were doing the favor. But Teotame was okay. True, after a few minutes talking to him, your eyes began to water and you felt the need to scrub your skin even on the inside. But no one was perfect, were they? Peachy leaned forward. "You know what?" he said. "I reckon he could be here already, in disguise, laughing at us. Well, if he's in here laughing at us..." He cracked his knuckles. Medium Dave Lillywhite, the last of the 5, looked round. There were indeed a number of solitary figures in the low, dark room. Most of them wore cloaks with big hoods. They sat alone in corners, hidden by the hoods. None of them looked very friendly. "Don't be daft," Peachy, Cat's Eye murmured. That's the sort of thing they do, Peachy insisted. They're masters of disguise. But that eye of his, that guy sitting by the fire has got an eye patch, said Medium Dave. Medium Dave didn't speak much. He watched a lot. The others turned to stare. He'll wait till we're off our guard, then go, aha, said Peachy. They can't kill you unless it's for money, said Cat's Eye. But now there was a soupçon of doubt in his voice. They kept their eyes on the hooded man. He kept his eye on them. If asked to describe what they did for a living, the 5 men around the table would have said something like, this and that, or the best I can. Although in Banjo's case he'd have probably said, der. They were, by standards of an uncaring society, criminals, although they wouldn't have thought of themselves as such, and couldn't even spell words like nefarious. What they generally did was move things around. Sometimes the things were on the wrong side of a steel door, say, or in the wrong house. Sometimes the things were in fact people who were far too unimportant to trouble the Assassin's Guild with, but who were nevertheless inconveniently positioned where they were and could much better be located on, for example, a seabed somewhere. None of the 5 belonged to any formal guild, and they generally found their clients among those people who, for their own dark reasons, didn't want to put the guilds to any trouble, sometimes because they were guild members themselves. They had plenty of work. There was always something that needed transferring from A to B, or, of course, to the bottom of the sea. Any minute now, said Peachy, as the waiter brought their beers. Banjo cleared his throat. This was a sign that another thought had arrived. What I don't understand, he said, is... Yes, said his brother. What I don't understand is how long has this place had waiters? Good evening, said Teotame, putting down the tray. They stared at him in silence. He gave them a friendly smile. Peach's huge hand slapped the table. You crept up on us, you little... he began. Men in their line of business develop a certain prescience. Medium Dave and Cat's Eye, who were sitting on either side of Peachy, leaned away nonchalantly. Hi, said Teotame. There was a blur, and a knife shuddered in the table between Peachy's thumb and index finger. He looked down at it in horror. My name's Teotame. Which one are you? Peachy, said Peachy, still staring at the vibrating knife. That's an interesting name, said Teotame. Are you called Peachy? Peachy? Medium Dave coughed. Peachy looked up into Teotame's face. The glass eye was a mere ball of faintly glowing grey. The other was a little dot in a sea of white. Peachy's only contact with intelligence had been to beat it up and rob it whenever possible, but a sudden sense of self-preservation glued him to his chair. "'Cause I don't shave," he said. "Peachy don't like blades, mister," said Cat's Eye. "And you have a lot of friends, Peachy?" said Teotame. "Got a few, yeah." With a sudden whirl of movement that made the men start, Teotame spun away, grabbed a chair, swung it up to the table, and sat down on it. 3 of them had already got their hands on their swords. "I don't have many," he said, apologetically. "Don't seem to have the knack. On the other hand, I don't seem to have any enemies at all. Not one. Isn't that nice?" Teotame had been thinking in the cracking, buzzing firework display that was his head. What he had been thinking about was immortality. He might have been quite insane, but he was no fool. There were, in the Assassin's Guild, a number of paintings and busts of famous members who had in the past put... No, of course that wasn't right. There were paintings and busts of the famous clients of members, with a noticeably modest brass plaque screwed somewhere nearby, bearing some unassuming little comment, like "Departed this vale of tears on Grune 3, year of the sideways leech, with the assistance of the Honourable K. W. Dobson, Viper House." Many fine old educational establishments had dignified memorials in some hall listing the old boys who had laid down their lives for monarch and country. The Guild's was very similar, except for the question of whose life had been laid. Every Guild member wanted to be up there somewhere, because getting up there represented immortality. And the bigger your client, the more incredibly discreet and restrained would be the little brass plaque, so that everyone couldn't help but notice your name. In fact, if you were very, very renowned, they wouldn't even have to write down your name at all. The men around the table watched him. It was always hard to know what Banjo was thinking, or even if he was thinking at all, but the other four were thinking along the lines of bumptious little tit, like all assassins. Thinks he knows it all. I could take him down one-handed, no trouble. But you hear stories. Those eyes give me the creeps. "So what's the job?" said Chickenwire. "We don't do jobs," said Teotame. "We perform services. And the service will earn each of you $10,000. "That's a lot more than Thieves' Guild rate," said Medium Dave. "Never liked the Thieves' Guild." "I've never liked the Thieves' Guild," said Teotame, without turning his head. "Why not?" "They ask too many questions." "We don't ask questions," said Chickenwire quickly. "We shall suit one another perfectly," said Tea Time. "Do have another drink while we wait for the other members of our little troop." Chickenwire saw Medium Dave's lips start to frame the opening letters. Ooh. These letters he deemed inauspicious at the time. He kicked Medium Dave's leg under the table. The door opened slightly. A figure came in, but only just. It inserted itself in the gap and sidled along the wall in a manner calculated not to attract attention. Calculated, that is, by someone not good at this sort of calculation. It looked at them over its turned-up collar. "That's a wizard," said Peachy. The figure hurried over and dragged up a chair. "No, I'm not," it hissed. "I'm incognito." "Right, Mr. Nito," said Medium Dave. "You're just someone in a pointy hat. This is my brother Banjo, that's Peachy, this is The wizard looked desperately at Tea Time. "I didn't want to come." "Mr. Sidney here is indeed a wizard," said Teotame. "A student, anyway. But down on his luck at the moment, hence his willingness to join us on this venture." "Exactly how far down on his luck?" said Medium Dave. The wizard tried not to meet anyone's gaze. "Made a misjudgment to do with a wager," he said. "Lost a bet, you mean?" said Chickenwire. "I paid up on time," said Sidney. "Yes, but Chrysoprase, the troll, has this odd little thing about money that turns into lead the next day," said Teotame cheerfully. "So our friend needs to earn a little cash in a hurry and in a climate where arms and legs stay on. No one said anything about there being magic in all this, said Peachy. Our destination is probably... You should think of it as something like a wizard's tower, gentlemen, said Teotame. It isn't an actual wizard's tower, is it? Said Medium Dave. They got very odd sense of humor when it comes to booby traps. No. Guards? I believe so, according to legend, but nothing very much. Medium Dave narrowed his eyes. There's valuable stuff in this tower? Oh, yes. Why aren't there many guards, then? The person who owns the property probably does not realize the value of what they have. Locks? Said Medium Dave. On our way, we shall be picking up a locksmith. Who? Mr. Brown. They nodded. Everyone, at least everyone in the business, and everyone in the business, knew what the business was. And if you didn't know what the business was, you weren't a businessman, knew Mr. Brown. His presence anywhere around a job gave it a certain kind of respectability. He was a neat, elderly man who'd invented most of the tools in his big leather bag. No matter what cunning you'd use to get into a place, or overcome a small army, or find the secret treasure room, sooner or later you sent for Mr. Brown, who'd turn up with his leather bag and his little springy things, and his little bottles of strange alchemy, and his neat little boots. And he'd do nothing for 10 minutes but look at the lock, and then he'd select a piece of bent metal from a ring of several hundred almost identical pieces, and under an hour later he'd be walking away with a neat 10% of the takings. Of course, you didn't have to use Mr. Brown's services. You could always opt to spend the rest of your life looking at a locked door. All right, where is this place? Said Peachy. Teotame turned and smiled at him. If I'm paying you, why isn't it me who's asking the questions? Peachy didn't even try to outstare the glass eye a second time. Just want to be prepared, that's all, he mumbled. Good reconnaissance is the essence of a successful operation, said Teotame. He turned and looked up at the bulk that was Banjo and added, What is this? This is Banjo, said Medium Dave, rolling himself a cigarette. Does it do tricks? Time stood still for a moment. The other men looked at Medium Dave. He was known to Ankh-Morpork's professional underclass as a thoughtful, patient man, and considered something of an intellectual because some of his tattoos were spelled right. He was reliable in a tight spot, and above all he was honest, because good criminals have to be honest. If he had a fault, it was his tendency to deal out terminal and definitive retribution to anyone who said anything about his brother. If he had a virtue, it was a tendency to pick his time. Medium Dave's fingers tucked the tobacco into the paper and raised it to his lips. No, he said. Chickenwire tried to defrost the conversation. He's not what you'd call bright, but he's always useful. You can lift 2 men in each hand by their necks. You're, said Banjo. He looks like a volcano, said Tea Time. Really? Said Medium Dave Lillywhite. Chickenwire reached out hastily and pushed him back down to his seat. Teotame turned and smiled at him. I do so hope we're going to be friends, Mr. Medium Dave. he said. "It really hurts to think I might not be among friends." He gave him another bright smile. Then he turned back to the rest of the table. "Are we resolved, gentlemen?" They nodded. There was some reluctance, given the consensus view that Teotame belonged in a room with soft walls. But $10,000 was $10,000, possibly even more. "Good," said Teotame. He looked Banjo up and down. "Then I suppose we might as well make a start." And he hit Banjo very hard in the mouth. Death, in person, did not turn up upon the cessation of every life. It was not necessary. Governments govern, but prime ministers and presidents do not personally turn up in people's homes to tell them how to run their lives, because of the mortal danger this would present. There are laws instead. But from time to time, death checked up to see that things were functioning properly, or to put it another and more accurate way, properly ceasing to function in the less significant areas of his jurisdiction. And now he walked through the dark seas. Silt rose in the clouds around his feet as he strode along the trench bottom. His robes floated around him. There was silence, pressure, and utter darkness. But there was life down here, even this far below the waves. There were giant squid and lobsters with teeth on their eyelids. There were spidery things with their stomachs on their feet, and fish that made their own light. It was a quiet, black, nightmare world, but life lives everywhere that life can. Where life can't, this takes a little longer. Death's destination was a slight rise in the trench floor. Already the water around him was getting warmer and more populated by creatures that looked as though they had been put together from the bits left over from everything else. Unseen but felt, a vast column of scalding hot water was swelling up from a fissure. Somewhere below were rocks heated to near incandescence by the disk's magical field. Spires of minerals had been deposited around this vent, and in this tiny oasis, a type of life had grown up. My apologies, everybody. Apparently I'm getting a bit sleepy. Where was I? It did not need air or light. It did not even need food in the way that most other species would understand the term. It just grew at the edge of the streaming column of water, looking like a cross between a worm and a flower. Death kneeled down and peered at it, because it was so small. But for some reason in this world without eyes or light, it was also a brilliant red. The profligacy of life in these matters never ceased to amaze him. He reached inside his robe and pulled out a small roll of black material, like a jeweler's toolkit. With great care he took from one of its pouches a scythe about an inch long and held it expectantly between the thumb and forefinger. Somewhere overhead a shard of rock was dislodged by a stray current and tumbled down, raising little puffs of salt as it bounced off the tubes. It landed just beside the living flower and then rolled, wrenching it from the rock. Death flicked the tiny scythe just as the bloom faded. The omnipotent eyesight of various supernatural entities is often remarked upon. It is said they can see the fall of every sparrow. And this may be true, but there is only one who is always there when it hits the ground. The soul of the tube worm was very small and uncomplicated. It wasn't bothered about sin. It had never coveted its neighbor's polyps. It had never gambled or drunk strong liquor. It had never bothered itself with questions like, why am I here? Because it had no concept at all of here, or for that matter, of I. Nevertheless, something was cut free under the surgical edge of the scythe and vanished in the roiling waters. Death carefully put the instrument away and stood up. All was well. Things were functioning satisfactorily. But they weren't. In the same way that the best of engineers can hear the tiny change that signals a bearing going bad long before the finest of instruments would detect anything wrong, Death picked up a discord in the symphony of the world. It was one wrong note among billions, but all the more noticeable for that, like a tiny pebble in a very large shoe. He waved a finger in the waters. For a moment a blue door-shaped outline appeared. He stepped through it and was gone. The tube creatures didn't notice him go. They hadn't noticed him arrive. They never ever noticed anything. A cart trundled through the freezing, foggy streets. The driver hunched in his seat. He seemed to be all big, thick brown overcoat. A figure darted out of the swirls and was suddenly on the box next to him. "Hi," it said. "My name's Teatame. What's yours?" "Here, you get down. I ain't allowed to give The driver stopped. It was amazing how Teatame had been able to thrust a knife through 4 layers of thick clothing and stop it just at the point where it pricked the flesh. "Sorry?" said Teatame, smiling brightly. There ain't nothing valuable, you know. Only a few bags of..." "Oh, dear," said Teatame, his face a sudden acre of concern. "Well, we'll just have to see, won't we? What's your name, sir?" "Ernie. Ernie," said Ernie. "Yes, Ernie. Teatame turned his head slightly. "Come along, gentlemen. This is my friend Ernie. He's going to be our driver for tonight." Ernie saw 6 figures emerge from the fog and climb into the cart behind him. He didn't turn to look at them. By the pricking of his kidneys, he knew this would not be an exemplary career move. But it seemed that one of the figures, a huge, shambling mound of a creature, was carrying a long bundle over its shoulder. The bundle moved and made muffled noises. "Do stop shaking, Ernie. We just need a lift," said Teatame as the cart rumbled over the cobbles. "Where to, mister?" "Where to? Where to, mister?" "We don't mind. But first, I'd like you to stop in Sata Square near the second fountain." The knife was withdrawn. Ernie stopped trying to breathe through his ears. What is it? You do seem tense, Ernie. I always find a neck massage helps." "I ain't rightly allowed to carry passengers. See, Charlie'll give me a right telling off." "Oh, don't you worry about that," said Teatame, slapping him on the back. "We're all friends here." "What are we bringing the girl for?" said a voice behind them. "It's not right, hitting girls," said a deep voice. "Our mam said no hitting girls. Only bad boys do that. Our mam said..." "You be quiet, Banjo." "Our mam said..." "Shh. Ernie here doesn't want to listen to our troubles," said Teatame, not taking his gaze off the driver. "Me? Deaf as a post, me," rumbled Ernie, who in some ways was a very quick learner. "Can't hardly see more'n a few feet, either. Got no recollection for them faces that I do see, come to that. Bad memory? Ah, Talk about bad memory. Of course, sometimes I can be like as it were on the cart, talking to people, just like I'm talking to you now, and then when they're gone, try as I might, do you think I can remember anything about them, or how many there were, or what they were carrying, or anything about any girl or anything? By this time, his voice was a high-pitched wheeze. Ah, sometimes I forget my own name. It's Ernie, isn't it? Said Teotame, giving him a happy smile. Ah, and here we are. Oh dear, there seems to be some excitement. There was the sound of fighting somewhere ahead, and then a couple of masked trolls ran past with 3 watchmen after them. They all ignored the car. I had the debris gang were going to have a go at Packley's strong room tonight, said a voice behind Ernie. Looks like Mr. Brown won't be joining us then, said another voice. It was a snigger. Oh, I don't know about that, Mr. Lillywhite. I don't know about that at all, said a third voice, and this one was from the direction of the fountain. Could you take my bag while I climb up, please? Do be careful, it's a little heavy. It was a neat little voice, the owner of a voice that kept his money in a shovel purse and always counted his change carefully. Ernie thought all this, and then tried very hard to forget that he had. On you go, Ernie. Round behind the university, I think. As the cart rolled on, the neat little voice said, You grab all the money, and then you get out very smartly. Am I right? There was a murmur of agreement. Learned that on my mother's knee, yeah? You learned a lot of stuff across your ma's knee, Mr. Lillywhite. Don't you say nothing about her, ma'am. The voice was like an earthquake. This is Mr. Brown, Banjo. You smarten up. He didn't ought to talk about our ma'am. All right, all right. Hello, Banjo. I think I may have a sweet somewhere. Yes, there you are. Yes, your ma knew the way, all right. You go in quietly, you take your time, you get what you came for, and you leave smartly and in good order. You don't hang around at the scene to count it out and tell one another what brave lads you are. Am I right? You seem to have it down all right, Mr. Brown. The cart rattled towards the other side of the square. Just a little for expenses, Mr. Cat's-eye. A little Hogswatch present, you might say. Never take the lot and run. Take a little and walk. Dress neat, that's my motto. Dress neat and walk away slowly. Never run. Never run. The watch will always chase a running man. They're like terriers for giving chase. No, you walk out slow, you walk round the corner, and you wait till there's a lot of excitement, then you turn around and walk back. They can't cope with that, you see. Half the time they'll stand aside to let you walk past. Good evening, officers, you say, and then you go home for your tea. Whee, gets you out of a lot of trouble. I can see that. You've got the nerve. Oh, no, Mr. Peach, it doesn't get you out of it. Keeps you out of it. It was like a very good schoolroom, Ernie thought, and immediately tried to forget. Or a backstreet gym when a champion prize fighter had just strolled in. It was like a very good... What's up here with your mouth, Banjo? He lost a tooth, Mr. Brown, said another voice, and sniggered. Lost a tooth, Mr. Brown, said the thunder that was Banjo. Keep your eyes on the road, Ernie, said Tea Time beside him. We don't want an accident, do we? The road here was deserted, despite the bustle of the city behind them, and the bulk of the university nearby. There were a few streets, but the buildings were abandoned, and something was happening to the sound. The rest of Ankh-Morpork seemed very far away, the sounds arriving as through quite a thick wall. They were entering that scorned little corner of Ankh-Morpork that had long been the site of the university's rubbish pits, and was now known as the Unreal Estate. Bloody wizards, muttered Ernie automatically. I beg your pardon? said Teotami. My great-grandpa. We used to own property around here. Low levels of magic, my arse. It's gotta be all right for them wizards. They got all kinds of spells to protect him. Bit of magic here, bit of magic there. Stands to reason it gotta go somewhere, right? There used to be warning signs up, said the neat voice from behind. Yeah, well, warning signs in Ankh-Morpork might as well have good firewood written on them, said someone else. I mean, stands to reason they chuck out an old spell for exploding this, and another one for twiddling that, and another one for making carrots grow. They finish up interfering with one another. Who knows what they'll end up doing, said Ernie. Great-grandpa said they'd wake up in the morning and the cellar would be higher than the attic. And that weren't the worst, he added darkly. Yeah, I heard it got so bad you could walk down the street and meet yourself coming the other way, someone supplied. Got so's you didn't know it was bum or breakfast time, I heard. The dog used to bring home all kinds of stuff, said Ernie. Great-grandpa said half the time they used to dive behind the sofa if it came in with anything in its mouth. Corroded fire spells starting to fizz, broken wands with green smoke coming out of them, and I don't know what else. And if you saw the cat playing with anything, it was best not to try to find out what it was, I can tell you. He twitched the reins, his current predicament almost forgotten in the tide of hereditary resentment. I mean, they say all the old spell books and stuff was buried deep and they recycle the used spells now, but that don't seem much comfort when your potatoes start walking about, he grumbled. My great-grandpa went to see the head wizard about it, and he said, he put on a strangled nasal voice which was his idea of how you talked when you'd got an education. Oh, there might be some temporary inconvenience now, my good man, but just you come back in 50,000 years. Bloody wizards. The horse turned a corner. This was a dead-end street. Half-collapsed houses, windows smashed, doors stolen, leaned against one another on either side. I heard they were going to clean this place up, said someone. Oh, yeah, said Ernie and spat, and it hit the ground. It ran away. And you know what? You get loonies coming in all the time now, poking around, pulling things about. Just the wall up ahead, said Teotami conversationally. I think you generally go through just where there's a pile of rubble by the old dead tree, although you wouldn't see it unless you looked closely. But I've never seen how you do it. Here, I can't take you lot through, said Ernie. Lifts is one thing, but not taking people through. Teotami sighed. We were getting on so well. Listen, Ernie. You will take us through, and I say this with considerable regret, I will have to kill you. You seem a nice man. Conscientious, a very serious overcoat, and sensible boots. But if I take you through, what's the worst that can happen? Said Teotami. You'll lose your job, whereas if you don't, you'll die. So if you look at it like that, we're actually doing you a favor. Oh, do say yes. Ernie's brain felt twisted up. The lad was definitely what Ernie thought of as a toff, and he seemed nice and friendly, but it didn't all add up. The tone and the content didn't match. Besides, said Teotami, if you've been coerced, it's not your fault, is it? No one can blame you. No one could blame anyone who'd been coerced at knife point. Oh, well, I suppose if we're talking coerced, Ernie muttered. Going along with things seemed to be the only way. The horse stopped and stood waiting with the patient look of an animal that probably knows the route better than the driver. Ernie fumbled in his overcoat pocket and took out a small tin, rather like a snuff box. He opened it. There was glowing dust inside. "What do you do with that?" said Teotame, all interest. "Oh, you just take a pinch and throws it in the air, and it goes twing, and it opens the soft place," said Ernie. "So you don't need any special training or anything? You just chucks it at the wall there, and it goes twing," said Ernie. "Really? May I try?" Teotame took the tin from his unresisting hand and threw a pinch of dust into the air in front of the horse. It hovered for a moment and then produced a narrow, glittering arch in the air. It sparkled and went doing. "Aw," said a voice behind them. "Ain't that nice, eh, our Davy?" "Yeah, all pretty sparkles." "And then you just drive forward?" said Teotame. "That's right. Quick mind, it only stays open for a little while." Teotame pocketed the tin. "Thank you very much, Ernie. Very much indeed." His other hand lashed out. There was a glint of metal. The carter blinked, and then fell sideways off his seat. There was silence from behind, tinted with horror and possibly just a little terrible admiration. "Wasn't he dull?" said Teotame, picking up the reins. Snow began to fall. It fell on the recumbent shape of Ernie, and it also fell through several hooded grey robes that hung in the air. There appeared to be nothing inside them. You could believe they were there merely to make a certain point in space. "Well," said no one, "we are frankly impressed." "Indeed," said another. "We would never have thought of doing it this way." "He is certainly a resourceful human," said a third. "The beauty of it all," said the first, or it may have been the second, because absolutely nothing distinguished the robes, "is that there is so much else we will control." "Quite," said another. "It is really amazing how they think. A sort of illogical logic." "Children," said another. "Who would have thought it? But today, the children, tomorrow, the world." "Give me a child until he is 7, and he is mine for life," said another. There was a dreadful pause. The consensus beings that themselves the auditors did not believe in anything except possibly immortality, and the way to be immortal, they knew, was to avoid living. Most of all, they did not believe in personality. To be a personality was to be a creature with a beginning and an end. And since they reasoned that in an infinite universe any life was by comparison unimaginably short, they died instantly. There was a flaw in their logic, of course, but by the time they found this out, it was always too late. In the meantime, they scrupulously avoided any comment, action, or experience that set them apart. "You said me," said one. "Ah, yes. But you see, we were quoting," said the other one hurriedly, "some religious person about educating children, and so would logically say me. But I wouldn't use that term of myself, of damn!" The robe vanished in a little puff of smoke. "Let that be a lesson to us," said one of the survivors, as another and totally indistinguishable robe appeared into existence where the stricken colleague had been. "Yes," said the newcomer. "Well, it certainly appears—" It stopped. A A dark shape was approaching through the snow. "It's him," it said. They faded hurriedly, not simply vanishing, but spreading out and thinning until they were just lost in the background. The dark figure stopped by the dead Carter and reached down. "Could I give you a hand?" Ernie looked up gratefully. "Caw, yeah," he said. He got to his feet, swaying a little. "Here, your fingers aren't half cold, mister." "Sorry." "What'd he go and do that for?" "I did what he said. He could have killed me." Ernie felt inside his overcoat, pulled out a small and at this point strangely transparent silver flask. "I always keep a nip on me these cold nights," he said. "Keeps my spirits up." "Yes, indeed." Death looked around briefly and sniffed the air. "How am I going to explain all this, then, eh?" said Ernie, taking a pull. "Sorry. That was very rude of me. I wasn't paying attention." "I said, what am I gonna tell people? Letting some bloke ride off with my cart neat as you like? That's gonna be the sack for sure. I'm gonna be in big trouble." "Ah, well, there at least I have some good news, Ernest. And then again, I have some bad news." Ernie listened. Once or twice he looked at the corpse at his feet. He looked smaller from the outside. He was bright enough not to argue. Some things are fairly obvious when it's a 7-foot skeleton with a scythe telling you them. "So I'm dead then," he concluded. "Correct." The priest said that, after you're dead, it's like going through a door, and on one side of it there's... well, a terrible place." Death looked at his worried, fading face. "Through a door. That's what he said. I expect it depends on the direction you're walking in." When the street was empty again, except for the fleshy abode of the late Ernie, the grey shapes came back into focus. "Honestly, he gets worse and worse," said one. "He was looking for us," said another. "Did you notice? He suspects something. He gets so concerned about things." "Yes, but the beauty of this plan," said a third, "is that he can't interfere. He can go everywhere," said one. "No," said another, "not quite everywhere." And, with ineffable smugness, they faded into the foreground. It started to snow, quite heavily. Ooh, oh, that did a number on my voice. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've been streaming for about 3 hours at this point. We have hit page 69 of the Hogfather. If you guys are interested, I may carry on reading some of this tomorrow. But at the moment, my lack of sleep is catching up with me quite severely by the sounds of the yawning that has been taking place these past few. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to call it for the evening. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening. I hope you all had fun. I hope you enjoyed listening to me reading The Hogfather, which was not what I expected to do today, but is apparently what I did. In the meantime, I am gonna throw all you lovely people at are lying in bed, Mon, who's currently playing some Sea of Thieves. I hope you all had fun. And yeah, I may come back tomorrow and continue reading the Hogfather on stream. Um, See if I can maybe keep a water bottle nearby for next time because, ooh, my throat feels a little rough now. At any rate, thank you very much for joining us this evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you all enjoyed. We shall see you all next time. Have a very good evening, everyone, and a very, very good night.